Hello everyone, good evening to all of you. Okay, so we're going to continue with the notes based off the lecture slides that the teacher gave us in Biochem. So we talked about chapter 14, this is chapter 15, and it's all about glycogen. And we're also going to be looking at the breakdown and synthesis of glycogen as well. We covered those two reactions in these very short rundown videos of the steps themselves. So this time it's just going to be like the background information, still very important for the test. And it's just going to be more of the rationale and stuff like that. So these are, again, from the lecture slides based off what was highlighted. All right, so the uses of glycogen. So glycogen is going to be the preferred energy source, since glucose, which makes up glycogen, is the preferred energy source. It's not readily available, so glycogen needs to be built from dietary glucose. It will be released from the liver or the kidney, also from there too, or it could also be used on site, such as the muscle glycogen. It's not transported when it's in the muscle. Glycogen breakdown is faster than gluconeogenesis. That's a very interesting piece right there. Glycogen is also synthesized and degraded, and the rates will depend on the state of the organism. So the physiological conditions of that organism will depend on whether it's being synthesized or degraded. All right, so a little bit about its structure before we move on. So we're going to have branched polymers of glucose that are bond together by this alpha 1 to 4. And every 12th unit, you're going to find this branch at an alpha 1 to 6. You're going to, again, store glycogen in the liver and the muscles, and when you degrade it, it goes into glucose units. You could make glycogen from either glucogenic amino acids or lactate. Lactate you could also use as well to create glycogen. Let's talk about glycogenolysis. This is the breakdown of glycogen to glucose 1-phosphate. Again, glucose 1-phosphate will need to be transformed into glucose 6-phosphate if we want to use glycolysis on it. However, there's some merit to having glucose 1-phosphate as well. So this happens in the cytosol. And we're going to be basically breaking the alpha 1,4 linkages. And we're going to create also a free glucose, which is broken from the alpha 1,6 linkage. All right, so again, a brief run through of all the steps. First step is we're going to take our glycogen and we're going to continuously cleave 4 units from alpha 1 to 6. So that means we're going to have 4 units away from that linkage, that alpha 1,6 linkage. We're going to cleave all of those from the non-reducing ends. Whenever we cleave those non-reducing ends off until we get to 4 away from that linkage, these are going to form free glucose 1-phosphate molecules. And the enzyme that we're going to be using is the glycogen phosphorylase for cleaving those alpha 1,4 linkages until we are, again, 4 units away from alpha 1,6, that branch. We're going to be using something called the, I guess I didn't write it down here. We're going to be using something called the pyridoxal phosphate. And this is going to be able to use that phosphorylated cleavage. All right, moving on to step 2, we're going to have this debranching enzyme form 2 functions. So both of these are actually the same enzyme. It's a debranching enzyme. The first step is to be using its transferase ability, where those 3 in front of the glucose, there's going to be this like branching again, the alpha 1 to 6 linkage. So the 3 in front of that glucose that's bound to the alpha 1,6, those are going to be transferred to the bottom, to this non-reducing end. So the bottom non-reducing end. So we get rid of like a branch by doing the transferase. Glucosidase function of the debranching enzyme is where we're going to chop off the free glucose. So we're going to create a regular free glucose. This is where that alpha-1 6 linkage used to exist. So we're going to chop off that. It's going to just be a regular glucose. Remember, in step 1, where glycogen was worked on by glycogen phosphorylase, chopping those alpha-1 4 units until it was 4 away from that glucose with the alpha-1 to 6 branch. Those resulted in glucose 1-phosphate. However, when we're using the debranching enzyme as a glucosidase to chop off that free glucose, that's just going to be regular glucose. The final step, if we're not in the liver, will be the glucose 1-phosphate. So one of the free units that were cleaved away in step 1 by the glycogen phosphorylase, one of those glucose 1-phosphates will become glucose 6-phosphate via the phosphoglucomutase enzyme. This enzyme has a serine, and that's an important note here, because if we take off that serine, if we take off this amino acid, it will be inactive. We can't go from glucose 1-phosphate to glucose 6-phosphate at all. So we need that serine there. In the liver, however, we do have this final step where the glucose 6-phosphatase will transform the glucose 6-phosphate into regular glucose, and this is going to be in the endoplasmic reticulum lumen. We're going to then increase the blood glucose concentration. When the glucose 6-phosphatase works on glucose 6-phosphate, it becomes regular glucose that goes into the bloodstream from the liver. All right, let's talk about glycogenesis. Okay, so now we are going to be making glycogen. So the blood glucose must be phosphorylated. It also has to be labeled with this UDP, and that U right there, that is uracil. That's where that UDP is. So we're going to then add it to a template glycogen. That's another important part. In order to use the blood glucose, you need it phosphorylated, you need UDP, and you also need a template glycogen. All right, so the main point is to use, again, these 3 components. We need to complete all these objectives. So let's work on our template glycogen first. We're going to be taking UDP glucose, which will be formed. We'll go over the step that forms UDP glucose, but let's pretend we already have some made. We have some UDP glucose, and we're going to be using this glycogenin template. This glycogenin template will use its tyrosine. We have a tyrosine amino acid on it, and this is going to allow the attack of a UDP glucose. And then, after we have that one on the glycogenin template, another UDP glucose will be attacked at the C1. So the C4 hydroxy on the terminal on the glycogenin template will be used to attack the C1 of another free-floating UDP glucose in the space. So we now have 2 glucose units. We are right here still. We still have 2 glucose units now in a chain. However, this sequence must repeat until we get to 8 glucose in our glycogen. So this is going to build those alpha-1 4 linkages by adding them in this order, where the first one is attached to the glycogenin template, and then it will attack another free UDP glucose. By the end of that, we have 2, so we need to repeat that 6 more times to get to an 8-chain glycogen. And that's, again, only alpha-1 4. We don't have the branches yet, unfortunately. Okay, so let's talk about making our UDP glucose, because remember, we need that as one of the steps. We need to tag it, we need to phosphorylate it, we need it, and then we also need our template. So we're also working on that too. So our glucose 6-phosphate could be transformed into glucose 1-phosphate via the same enzyme phosphoglucomutase that we used in step 4 of glycogenolysis. It's because this reaction is actually reversible. And once it's glucose 1-phosphate, we could then add our UTP, or uracil triphosphate. This is again uracil, this U right here. And when we use this enzyme, UDP glucose pyrophosphorylase, we get pyrophosphate as well as our UDP glucose. So that UDP glucose, remember, that's one of our objectives there. We've tagged it with UDP, so we are good to go on that end. However, we could also use this pyrophosphate. We could basically split it, not reduce it, because then that's a different term in biochem, but we could reduce it even further. We could use a pyrophosphatase to make 2 inorganic phosphates. That's just like an aside. All right, so we have our glucose template. It still doesn't have a branch, so we need to make that branch. Let's see how we're going to make that branch. That will be using the glycogen branching enzyme listed here. We're going to take 7 glucose units from the non-reducing end that are all alpha 1 to 4 linkages, and we're going to move them to the glycogen core using glycogen branching enzyme. So when we attach it to the glycogen core, we make this new alpha 1,6 linkage in our glycogen template. So now we have the template and we also have our UDP glucose. Therefore, we could now go to the final payoff step here, step 5. UDP glucose plus our glycogen, which is going to be N greater than 4. Again, this is our glycogen template. So the UDP glucose plus the glycogen template, when we use glycogen synthase, which is listed down here as the enzyme, this makes a new glycogen molecule with N equals 5, or N greater than 5, I should say. There's more than 5 units now. Okay, let's talk about muscle glycogen regulation. And this is going to be involving glycogen breakdown again. So we're going to be playing around with the glycogen phosphorylase. Glycogen phosphorylase will be breaking down those alpha 1,6 bonds in our glycogen molecule. If we go back to glycogenolysis, sorry about that, we have it listed right here. So again, glycogen, we cut those alpha 1,4 linkages until we're 4 units away from the alpha 1,6, and each of those broken away pieces will be a glucose 1-phosphate. So that's a reminder of what this enzyme does. Okay, so we have 2 types. We have glycogen phosphorylase A, which is active. This is catalytically active. We also have glycogen phosphorylase B, which is much less active. However, when we have epinephrine from muscle activity, so it's like adrenaline, and glucagon in the liver, this is going to trigger the phosphorylation of the phosphorylase B, converting it into the much active form phosphorylase A. Again, remember, phosphorylase A, that's like phosphorylase active. It's much more active than phosphorylase B. So when this happens, we're going to go through a cascade here. Let me see where I'm at. Okay, there we go. We're going to make a cascade. There we are. Okay, so when we have those serines, we're going to have the phosphorylation of them, again, through glucagon from the liver and epinephrine from the muscle, as well as calcium and AMP. All right, so we have this whole cascade. It's like GPCR all over again. So we have one molecule of epinephrine and glucagon going into their receptor proteins. That's going to go and jumpstart this reaction where ATP through adenylyl cyclase, again, one of the big players in GPCR, we're going to then make cyclic AMP or CAMP. So that's our cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP is going to activate pKa. pKa, when it's active, plus calcium, so we need some calcium going in here. We're going to activate phosphorylase B kinase. We're not going to activate the phosphorylase yet. This is just the kinase, phosphorylase B kinase. When phosphorylase B kinase is turned on, we're going to get to our glycogen phosphorylase B turning on itself into glycogen phosphorylase A. So therefore, it's in the, again, most catalytically active state of that glycogen phosphorylase. Once glycogen phosphorylase A is active, we're going to get glycogen broken down into glucose 1-phosphates. Remember, cleaving all of those alpha 1,4 linkages until we are 4 units away from that branch. That's going to create 10,000 glucose 1-phosphate molecules. Again, it's a cascade. It's being amplified through this process of all of these phosphorylations. So now those glucose 1-phosphates, they could either be converted for glycolysis. Remember phosphoglucomutase, we're going to use that, get it to glucose 6-phosphate, and then we're going to go to glycolysis, and that's energy for muscle contraction. I don't know why I crossed it out there. I am so sorry about that. And we could also take our glucose 1-phosphate and use our glucose 1-phosphatase enzyme in the liver, break it down to regular glucose, and increase the blood glucose level. And then again, 10,000 molecules after this whole cascade. That's a ton. That's a good amount. After that, we're again just going to mention calcium is to also trigger phosphorylase B kinase. AMP is also going to increase this cascade. ATP, however, will block it. It's all allosteric. ATP will block the allosteric site, and it will inactivate this phosphorylase A, turning it into B once more. Why are we releasing glucose from glycogen, and why are we breaking it down if we already have ATP, We want to save those resources. All right, let's talk about phosphoprotein phosphatase 1, also known as PP1. It's the first PP. Removes phosphoryl groups from phosphorylase A and converts it to the less active form, phosphorylase B. This enzyme is also part of this system. Remember how we were talking about how phosphorylase A is active when it's phosphorylated by the kinase? Well, PP1 will take away those phosphate groups, and now it's phosphorylase B. It's less active. All right, let's talk about glycogenesis regulation. Sorry about that. I keep messing it up. I'll get it right someday. Okay, so we're going to again talk about regulating the making of glycogen. So we have this insulin signaling pathway. However, let's go back to PP1 here first. I forgot to mention something. I forgot to mention glucose here. Sorry about that, glucose. So we have empty allosteric sites in our phosphorylated phosphorylase A. Remember, that's when it's extremely active. We insert glucose into those allosteric sites, and this increases the activity of PP1. It makes it very vigor. Also, if we have insulin from when there's high blood glucose and insulin's coming in from the liver, that's also going to just jumpstart this PP1, and it's going to make it easier to remove those phosphates from phosphorylase A, turning it into phosphorylase B. Therefore, the inactive version, or the less active version. All right, now let's go to the insulin signaling pathway. Sorry, we had to take a detour there. So this is again going to be glycogenesis regulation. So it will increase glucose import into the muscle. We're going to also increase the activity of hexokinase 1 to 3. We're also going to activate glycogen synthase. Remember, glycogen synthase requires UDP glucose plus our glycogen template to make new glycogen. All right, increased hexokinase activity will activate glucose, and then glycogen synthase will make more glycogen for energy storage, which I just basically said that. Okay, glycogen synthase will be controlled. Again, there's two forms of it, glycogen synthase A and glycogen synthase B. There's a kicker here. Glycogen synthase A, when it's active, there's no phosphates on it. It's not phosphorylated. When it's phosphorylated, that's when it's going to be glycogen synthase B, and it's inactive unless glucose 6-phosphate is present. No phosphates, that means it's active. That's glycogen synthase A. So it's reverse of what we saw with glycogenolysis. We also have this glycogen synthase kinase 3. This enzyme will add phosphates to glycogen synthase A. In order to inhibit it, it's going to become glycogen synthase B. Once GSK3 is finished phosphorylating the synthase, it's going to turn into B, or inactive. PP1 is also involved here. So if we have insulin, this is going to drive glycogen synthase to be active. It's going to drive glycogen synthase A. If we have glucose 6-phosphate, that's also going to be for glycogen synthase A. If we have increased amounts of glucose, that's also going to drive glycogen synthase A. It's also going to drive PP1 too, because PP1, remember, PP1 removes phosphates. However, when we remove phosphates from glycogen synthase, we're actually activating it. The unphosphorylated form is the active enzyme in glycogen synthase. So the reverse is also true. If we have glucagon and epinephrine, that's going to not push forwards into glycogen synthase A. So, a summary here. In the liver, we're going to replenish the glucose there. So insulin will activate glycogen synthase by inactivating GSK3, and it will also activate PP1. So let's draw this out. Maybe it might help. So insulin will activate glycogen synthase. In order to activate glycogen synthase, we are going to need to, again, remove the phosphates off of it. So PP1 removes the phosphates. And then GSK3, this GSK3 will also be inactivated. Remember, GSK3 adds phosphates, so we don't want that if we're trying to turn on glycogen synthase A. Okay, also in the liver we have glucagon. Remember, glucose is gone. Glucagon. Okay, glucagon will simulate glycogen breakdown. So this is going to be affecting glycogen phosphorylase A. It's going to turn it to the active form. It's also going to activate gluconeogenesis. Glycogen breakdown happens before gluconeogenesis, just a side note. We're going to, however, block glycolysis. We need to make more glucose in this step here. All right. In the muscle, however, we're going to have epinephrine. Epinephrine will provide ATP by simulating glycogen breakdown and glycolysis. So the muscle has this epinephrine again. I'm just going to rewrite it. This is going to say yes to breaking down. So again, it's going to somehow affect glycogen phosphorylase A. However, we are going to have glycolysis because we want to make ATP. Once we break the glycogen and get our glucose, we want to use that glucose for something. In the liver here, remember, we're concerned of building either glucose or creating more glycogen for storage. However, in the muscle, it's all about making that ATP and powering up the system. And that's going to be it. Thanks so much for tuning in. That was chapter 15. Please do something nice for someone and take care. Good luck, everyone.